Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to episode 12. Today we're going to be talking about the password to Larkspur Lane. I also want to say real quick, I hope you had a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays, and I don't know about you, but I am excited about the prospect of a new year. It's hard to believe that this year is already come and gone, but I don't know, do you guys set resolutions? Because I don't really do that. I feel like I have goals in mind for sure, but I'm not like a hardcore resolution setter. I think one of my main resolutions or goals from this last year was really to just start a podcast about something that I'm passionate about, and that's Nancy Drew, and that's this podcast. So I'm excited to say that I accomplished that goal. So I don't know, going forward, I think I would probably say, delve more into these episodes for this podcast and maybe travel more. I love to go on vacation. Speaking of vacations, I'm actually on one at the time of this episode being released. I'm probably like screaming my head off on the Tower of Terror in Disney World if I had to guess. But it's so weird, like scheduling podcast episodes. Sometimes I feel like I'm a time traveler. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and jump into Password to Larkspur Lane. And this book was written in 1933, and it is the 10th book in the Nancy Drew series. Now, if you follow along on Instagram, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast, I like to post the covers of these different books the day before the episode releases, because I like you all to know kind of the imagery that we're talking about. And I actually found 4 separate covers for this book, and there were some that I'd never seen before. Now, all of these are fairly similar in nature. They all pretty much show Nancy next to a fence talking to an older woman in a wheelchair. But in this first edition of the cover that I posted, we have Nancy in this very beautiful red dress with white lace trim, and we see a man shaking his fist and running across a yard, and there's a mansion in the background. And the older woman across from her on the other side of the fence is whispering. She's got her hand up to her mouth and she's pointing at that guy who's running at them. Nancy looks very different in each of these covers too, but in this first cover, she has the short blonde waved hair that we associate with the 1930s. Now, in this second cover, it's very similar. We have Nancy, she's still crouched down by the fence, but this time she's wearing a black skirt and a pink puff-sleeved shirt. And the woman who is sitting in the wheelchair is wearing a lighter colored, like blue sweater. And this time we see a man and a woman running across the yard and the man shaking his fist at Nancy and this woman. In the third edition of this Nancy Drew book cover, this Nancy looks a lot like Grace Kelly. Like, I swear they took her picture and they just kind of embodied her as Nancy on this cover. And she's wearing a red sweater with a shirt underneath it, a blue skirt. And the man who's running at them, he looks like he's got more pep in his step on this cover. And the older woman is wearing like a purple checked shawl. As for the fourth and final cover, Nancy is kind of looking over her shoulder and pretending to maybe not make eye contact with this older woman. And she's got the red flipped out hair. She's wearing a mustard yellow dress. And we see the larkspur around the older woman's wheelchair. And she's wearing a very bright red amulet necklace. And the man in the background in front of the mansion is just standing there sinisterly looking at them. I think it's interesting that there's 4 different editions of this cover, but yet they're all very, very similar in nature. That's very unlike some of the other books that we've seen in the past. The covers are drastically different, but these pretty much all the artists were on the same page. They're like, yep, woman in a wheelchair, Nancy talking to her through the fence, and a man in a mansion in the background. They understood the assignment. Now, I like to come up with some funny cover spoofs of these covers, and I came up with 2 or 3. So the first cover spoof is, "Don't look now, but here comes one of the X-Men." I feel like Mrs. Eldridge, which is the lady in the wheelchair, could definitely be like the female version of Professor Xavier. The second cover spoof that I came up with, because it looks like the older woman, Mrs. Eldridge, is whispering to Nancy through the fence, And so I came up with, between you and me, the mashed potatoes here are nothing to write home about. And the last cover spoof that I came up with is, this assisted living facility is big yikes. I know we've talked about elder abuse in previous books on this podcast, but saddle up because there is a lot of it in this book. But I gave the book covers for this book a rating of 4 magnifying glasses. I really liked each one of these covers. They're very interesting to look at. And they're all similar yet different, which I appreciated. The colors are kind of interesting. And yeah, I thought it was really appealing visually. Now onto the characters in this book. There are quite a few, but we have Bess and George, and then we have Helen Archer, formerly known as Helen Corning, and she asks Nancy to help solve a little side mystery with her grandparents' estate, and that ends up tying into the overall mystery. But we also have the Cornings, Helen's grandparents, and they have this guy who works for them named Morgan, and they just call him their houseman, which made me laugh every time I read it. There's also a Dr. Spire, who is a bone doctor that the Drews know, and he gets abducted in this book. There's a Lieutenant Mulligan, who is a police officer in a neighboring town that Nancy deals with. There is a character of Jean Moss and Bill Wright. I don't really remember what they were doing in this book, but they're in this book. And there's Adam Thorne, who was an embezzler that Mr. Drew had some dealings with, and Effie Schneider, who is Hannah Gruen's niece, and she's just described as having blonde hair with feathery bangs. She also has a bizarre just obsession with Hollywood. Some more characters include the Eldridges, and they have a little girl named Marie. They are related to Mrs. Eldridge, who is the woman on the cover who was in the wheelchair at the assisted living facility. There is Miss Tyson, who's a nurse at that facility, and Dr. Bell Luther, who is at that facility. And then the name of all names is Adolf Tooker, who is apparently, he has another name. It's like Van Hofwitz. I don't know, but he's the pigeon guy. And when I think of him, I think of Will Ferrell in The Producers. If you know, you know.
Go on and fly, my little lieblings, and deliver this message AQAP as quick as possible.
I'm so stupid. And you're like, yes, you are. Now on to the synopsis for this book. Our story starts with Nancy and Hannah trimming larkspur at the Drew home when a carrier pigeon falls from the sky, and simultaneously a tan plane's engine falters before correcting itself. That is a tongue twister. A tan plane. A tan plane. Okay, anyway, Nancy wonders if the pigeon fell from the plane or got harmed by flying into the engine. She checks the pigeon for a message and finds this: trouble here. After 5 o'clock, bluebells will be singing horses. Come tonight. Nancy then takes her flowers to a flower show, and on the way home, sees Dr. Spire, a family friend. She notices a dark car on the side of the road with the same starting numbers the pigeon had on its leg. Dr. Spire gets yanked into this car, and Nancy wonders if he's been abducted. Back at home, Hannah falls going down to the cellar, and Nancy takes her to Dr. Spire's home, but he hasn't returned. She answers the phone while there and gets another bluebell message. When Dr. Spire finally returns, he tells Nancy that he was kidnapped and gives her a bracelet, which may be a clue. Nancy is then intimidated by an ex-embezzler, Adam Thorne, and a woman in pink steals her purse, but she gets it back. Meanwhile, Effie, Hannah's niece, has come to help around the house since Hannah's back is sprained. Nancy also follows the pigeon once it gets loose and follows it back to its home, stumbling upon a compound of pigeons and one Adolf Tooker. Nancy later finds out she won first prize at the flower show and is almost attacked by a Great Dane. Nancy is drawn into another mystery by her friend Helen Archer. Her grandparents keep seeing a blue circle of fire on their property. Morgan, the Corning grandparents' employee and houseman, also keeps disappearing, and mysterious notes arrive for him at the house. Nancy decides to fake an injury to lure out would-be thieves trying to steal priceless crystal from the Cornings, only to find Morgan himself. She deduces he's an ex-con, and Adam Thorne is blackmailing him. Nancy also finds out from a Miss Eldridge who lives on the lake, after saving her daughter Marie from a boat, that the bracelet Dr. Spire found may belong to her husband's missing aunt. Nancy finally finds Larkspur Lane and discovers the Eldridge's missing aunt is being held hostage there. Bess dresses as a nurse, and Nancy dresses as an older lady, and they sneak into the assisted living facility. Nancy busts Miss Eldridge out, but gets caught and thrown in a cistern. She's able to climb out, leaks fuel from the getaway plane, sends a carrier pigeon message to Ned, and the police show up and arrest the bad guys. Phew, that's a lot. There is a lot going on in this book. So as far as my newspaper headline synopsis goes, I came up with assisted extortion. Fraudulent care facility shut down thanks to Nancy Drew. Now, you might have noticed in the synopsis that there's a mention of bluebells. It may seem familiar because in Mystery at Lilac Inn, the villains used a code with blue pipes. So, lilacs, blue pipes, larkspur, blue bells. It's kind of confusing. The language of flowers is usually reserved for friendship and romance. Who knew that the language of flowers could be so deadly? Now, I took down some direct quotes and things I noticed in this book because I like to do that. I think it's interesting to write down the things that stick out to me. So, apparently there's a Federation of American Homing Pigeon Fanciers. Like, that's a thing. There's a group of people. Apparently in this book, anyway. And when this poor pigeon falls out of the sky, Nancy just knows to contact them. She's like, I'll contact the Federation of American Homing Pigeon Fanciers. I mean, it does seem like the most logical thing to do. So my next note, Nancy tries to be really deep in the beginning of this book. It's funny because Hannah's like, what were you thinking about, Nancy? And Nancy says, I was thinking that if I had lived 2,000 years ago, I might have been a Grecian maiden. And in that case, I might be praying right now in the Temple of Apollo. Like, what? Nancy, what are you talking about? Like, is this like the Roman Empire thing? Like, you ask men how many times they think about the Roman Empire. You ask Nancy Drew, and she's just like, yeah, I think about being a Grecian goddess sometimes. It's really random. Now, the next thing that I wrote down, this was kind of interesting. So, when Nancy goes to the flower show, she goes to the Blenheim estate, which is referenced in The Secret of the Old Clock video game. They have Blenheim Nursery is one of the locations that you can go and drop a telegram off to, so I thought this was cool. Her Interactive did such a good job with that game in particular, with the different locations and nods to the books. So my next note just says there's a chapter called Frightened Grandparents. I very rarely pay attention to the names of the chapters. Like, if I did, I would probably know more about what's going to go on. But Frightened Grandparents, I read that at the beginning of that chapter and I almost spit my drink out that I was drinking. I don't know why. I thought that was so funny. So my next note has to do with Effie, and she is Hannah Gruen's niece, and she comes over to help when Hannah sprains her back. And Effie, apparently, in this part of the book, she says, the pigeon man's here. He's very good looking. Because, you know, Nancy contacts the American Federal Pigeon Reserve, fanciers, whatever. And this guy comes by, and his name is Donald Jordan. And so I put Donald Jordan, the man with two first names. I don't know what it is with Nancy Drew books, but all of the men, a lot of the men, have two first names. Donald Jordan, we had Don Cameron, and then the guy that Bess was, like, dating, I think it was Burt Allen or something weird. I don't know. Also, Donald Jordan talks about pigeon credentials, and I don't know why, but that just made me die laughing. I guess pigeons get pulled over too sometimes. They're like, hey, I'm going to have to see your license and registration, ma'am. Where's your credentials? No, really. He says that these pigeons have to have numbers associated with them, and if they don't, they're illegally owned pigeons. Now, the next thing I wrote down looks like I said, Carson says, but Nancy, my first concern is for your safety. You are more important to me than all the mysterious old ladies in the world. A rousing sentiment, Carson. The next thing I wrote down just has to do with the Cornings' house, Helen's grandparents. I just said the Cornings have pumpkin-colored chairs. Sounds pretty. I don't know. That was just an interesting way to describe that. Instead of orange, they were just like pumpkin-colored. Pumpkin spice chairs. So this next thing that I wrote down, when Bess says she's afraid of running into kidnappers, George says, now don't be a snob. Now that kind of made me laugh. I knew it was George just joking. She wasn't actually being a jerk to Bess like she is so much of the time. Let's see, this next thing that I wrote down, Nancy goes to show Ned paper fragments she found near where the blue flame was, and he says, you don't expect me to look at this when I could be looking at you. Aw, Ned. So the villains in this book were very creepy because Adam Thorne suggests putting Nancy in the cistern without food or drink with the spiders and the rats. that just gave me a chill when I read it, because I was like, oh my gosh, like those rats could like bite her, and the spiders like, don't sign me up for the cistern. And I also was like, cistern, is that what I think it is? Like sewage and stuff? But it apparently helps toilets to flush, but there's not actually poop in there. So, for those who want to know. I also wrote down Nancy thought fast with those costumes. So Bess dresses up like a nurse and Nancy dresses up like an older woman to get into the care facility and infiltrate it. And I thought this was so cool. I like that Nancy did this because it's just so funny trying to picture it, but it apparently worked. I mean, it also definitely helped that they intercepted that pigeon and they knew the password to get in the first place, but you know. Okay, so this next thing really scared me. Nancy was answered by a throaty chuckle in the dark cistern. This scared the crap out of me when I read it. Like, I actually jumped, but it was just pigeons. She could hear the pigeons that are nearby in the barn, but that was scary. My next note is just, are we going to talk about how these people were drugging elderly women and trying to swindle them out of their money? Then they were just going to lock them in the cellar, because when everything starts to go down, Adam Thorne is like, we got to get out of here and we got to go get on this plane. And he's just going to basically lock these women in the cellar with no food and no hopes of getting out. Awful. Now, I thought it was sweet when Nancy solved the mystery. Miss Corning actually buys the girls crystal Larkspur earrings, Nancy, Bess, and George. So I thought that was cool. And my final note is just, Ned says, I'll find you a mystery by tomorrow morning. And Nancy says, make it complicated and original. So Nancy showed a lot of skills in this book. So for this next section of the podcast episode, we have add that to your resume. So I put that Nancy is an aviary medical specialist because she nurses this little pigeon back to health. And I mean, she puts it in a box and puts it up on the shelf, which I'm like, okay. But she knows how to fix him up. So points. I also put that Nancy is a lifeguard because she saves Marie from being hit by a boat. And Marie is the Eldridge's daughter. She falls in the water. And of course, Nancy's there at the opportune moment and dives down and saves her from getting hit. Nancy is also a master of disguise. She and Bess dress up to get into the care facility. And that was probably one of my favorite parts of this book. Next, I put down that Nancy is a fuselage saboteur. She knows how to empty planes of fuel and keep villains from getting away. So, pretty cool. And last but finally not least, I put Nancy is a rock climber / cistern climber because Adam Thorne basically breaks the ladder for her to get out and throws it down there at her. And so she uses the rungs to climb out of the cistern. She sticks them into the mud and climbs out, which, that's so disgusting. I don't even want to think about it. Now, on to our next section of the podcast, which is What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen. And Hannah didn't do too much cooking in this book. She sprained her back, so understandable. But she made hot biscuits and chicken, and I took a note of this. She said that's one of Carson's favorites, and she also says he likes sweet pickles. I'm picturing like the 1930s version of a Chick-fil-A biscuit, and you know what? That does sound very, very good. Carson has good taste. Now on to the things that I liked and didn't like about Password to Larkspur Lane. So the first thing that I liked about this book was there were high stakes. These criminals were intense. They were going to lock these older ladies in the cellar. I mean, we're dealing with a guy named Adolf here. You know, I was scared for Nancy at several points in this book when she's going around the care facility and sneaking around, when she gets thrown into the cistern. It's pretty scary. I also like the fact that Nancy is so brave in this book. She knew that she could get caught. She knew there were so many things that could happen to her, and she did them anyway. And I don't have any direct quotes on that, but several times she was like, I know that this is, going to put me in danger. I think she tells her dad that at several points, but she's like, I have to do it. And the third and final thing that I liked about this book was the disguises that she and Bess wore. It was genius. I loved that aspect of this book. I thought it was so fun and so innovative. I loved that they did that. Now for the things that I didn't like. So you knew this was going to be on here, but the elder abuse, the fact that Mrs. Eldridge was being held against her will, apparently she was promised like this fountain of youth or something. They were just like, yeah, come to the care facility. You'll be younger than you've ever been before. And then when she gets there, they won't let her go. And then, as if to add insult to injury, they're just like, we're going to take your inheritance and your money, haha. And super evil. But then they're going to lock these people in the cellar. Like, I'm sure they slap these people around. Like, the nurse that is there that also stole Nancy's purse, she is just straight up evil. As for the final thing that I didn't like about this book, I didn't like that Adam Thorne was blackmailing Morgan, the man who worked for the Cornings. Morgan was an ex-con, like Adam Thorne, but he was trying to make his life better. He was trying to forget his past and move on and have a normal job, and Adam Thorne couldn't let him do that. He was just like, no, you're going to steal from your employers, and you're going to do this, and I'm going to tell everybody, who you really are. And it made me upset for Morgan. I didn't like Adam Thorne, but then I guess you're really not supposed to like the villains anyway. So my overall rating for the password to Larkspur Lane is going to be 4 magnifying glasses. I know a lot of the books that I've reviewed recently, I've said 3 magnifying glasses. I feel like that's a good middle ground, but this one was a step above. The villains were very dark, very complicated. The plots went well together, and I really felt drawn to the characters. Like, I wanted these people to be helped. Some of the people that Nancy helps are, I don't know, kind of annoying sometimes, or, I don't feel that sympathy for them, but I feel like these characters, I really felt that. I also loved how Nancy had to use a lot of her skills and detective work to actually find Larkspur Lane, because she was just going off of this carrier pigeon and the note that she received, and she knew that there were Larkspur around, but that doesn't really narrow it down. So it took a lot of detective work for her to figure out where this place actually was. So yeah, I really loved this book, and I want to know what you all think. If you are following us on Instagram at True Drew Podcast, I'd love to know what you thought about this book. If it's one of your favorites, it happens to be one of my favorites. It's probably in my top 10, but let me know on Instagram. I would love to talk about it with you. So for next week's episode, we are going to be talking about the clue of the broken locket. And this episode's going to be a little bit different than some of the ones that we have been doing, because I actually have a copy of the original The Clue of the Broken Locket and a revised. So I thought it would be really interesting for this episode to compare the two and see how similar they are. Spoiler alert, they are completely different books. It is crazy. I thought the original and the revised were going to be pretty similar, but they couldn't be more different. So it's going to be pretty fascinating. We're going to be talking basically about 2 different books simultaneously. So it will be a little bit longer of an episode. So I hope you all will tune in for that episode next Thursday, and it will be 2024 then. So Happy New Year, and I will see you all then. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.